Hello, everyone. I know we've got a lot of new employees lately, so if you don't know me, I'm Rostin. I've been here for about 2 years. I would say I've seen our products pretty much go from infancy to where they are today. If you don't know, in the last few months, I've actually changed roles. So in the past, I've been an engineer, but in the last few months, I've become the one thing I've always feared most, a designer. I remember when I was implementing screens in Striver Creator, one time Paul sent me some wireframes for a creator screen. And he had very carefully arranged all of these text fields so that they were all lined up. They had these perfect paddings between them. The padding behind the bottom field and the button was the same as the padding behind the next field. And I just looked at this design and I was like, wouldn't it be much simpler if I just sort of put them all in a row and didn't worry about all this? And Paul is looking at my implementation a week later and he's like, well, what happened? What happened to my padding? What happened to my rows? And I'm like, designers, you know, like whatever. And karma's a bitch, isn't it? So one thing I've come to learn now that I'm on the other side of things is when a designer makes a padding a certain size, and when like the padding behind the bottom field and a button is different, that was not something that they did arbitrarily or because it looked good. These are decisions that have been made very carefully for specific reasons. I've had to work a lot with Tony in recent months, and Tony and I will work together on something, and he'll be like, oh, I think after you've done an experience, the next experience should just appear right there and prompt you to do it. And like, man, if we wanted that to happen, I would have to re-engineer this. It would have to be like that. Tony will just come to me and be like, shh, shh, shh. Don't think about that, right? Think about the blue sky. Think about what is the best possible experience for the user. And this has been a major mental shift for me because I've had to change the fundamental way I think, which is as an engineer, where I think about how can I implement this efficiently? How can I get it done? How can I not break legacy content? How can it work with a good runtime? And I've had to think about instead, like, what sparks joy, right? If it doesn't spark joy, throw it out. So basically what I've been doing is I've been imagining not what our product is, but what it could be. This is an example of this new menu design I've been working on. Oh God, sorry, there's someone doing construction in the background. This is not a good user experience, by the way. Let me use this. Anyway, so what I've been doing is sort of imagining what would our menu system be like if the cards had physicality to them. If rather than just being a flat UI where you just click on things and things happen, if there was some kind of a metaphor to how you select things and how you perceive objects in Striver Player. And this has caused me to sort of question everything I've ever believed. So yeah, in a nutshell, you know, designers and engineers think very differently about these sorts of things. And coming at the engineering of a new feature from a design perspective has forced me to change actually how I code things as well, which I didn't necessarily expect. I'm going to give you guys a concrete example. So yeah, the engineering mindset is to just hide everything. We call it encapsulation. We want all our variables to be private. Class A knows nothing about Class B except what Class B wants to know. And as a designer, I've had the opposite approach, which is that I have to expose everything. And the reason for that is I have to expose what the designers need to create the best experience. One of the things I've learned to expose is animation curves for how objects move. So the new menu, the cards in the menu are like physical objects, and they have to move around. Now, as an engineer, if I have an object that goes from point A to point B, what's the fastest way between 2 points? It's a straight line, constant speed. So if I'm just doing this as an engineer, the object's just going to move, and that's going to be it. But as a designer, if I want an object to have a physicality, real objects don't move in straight lines, and they don't move at constant speeds. So I actually had to rethink how I build movement in Striver Player to account for curves. I had to engineer it a little bit differently. So these are some easing functions. So this is a way you can create more naturalistic movement with math. My buddies, math. This is a little demonstration of how that could work. So in order to make this work, one of the things that was really important to me is that I can make these changes at runtime. So rather than having to, can I get rid of this thing here? This is so here's like a basic curve. This is that kind of dumb curve I talked about, which is just a linear curve. And the object just moved from point A to point B in a straight line. And that's sort of something you're used to from like basically implemented video games or user interfaces where an object just goes doop and it moves. Here's a different kind of curve where the objects start slow and go fast. It's not a very naturalistic curve, but it has a different character to it. Now this is what we call an ease. This is sort of like one of the classic curves that people use to get more naturalistic movement. It's sort of subtle, but it has a more of a natural feel to it. One of the things that Yazan showed me when I started working on this is he suggested something I never would have thought of, which is a sort of a bounce. So going back to this 3-pound weight here, if I throw the weight up in the air and I catch it, the point at which I catch it isn't the bottom of its curve. Because it has a weight, my hand is pushed downwards, even though I don't really want that to happen. Because the object has weight, it has momentum, it's physical. It resists its velocity changing. So as this regards to the cards, when they start moving, they don't stop right away. So this was kind of an interesting exploration because I did this and I was very excited about it because it has this bounce to it. It's very playful. But as I thought about it and I sort of stewed on this, I realized that this is the kind of thing that doesn't quite mesh with the feeling we're trying to convey. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is the mood of Striver software. Our software has to convey a certain mood. And this mood, I think, doesn't quite match. It's a little bit too much, maybe like me. So I had to tone it down a little bit. So this is how I toned this down. And you can barely see it now, but it's still there. It's very subtle, but it's still getting that sort of feel of momentum. So let's see. This segs into mood. So Striver software has a certain mood. Now, when I'm thinking about the mood of corporate software, one of the things I looked at first was Slack, because we all use it every day. And I really connect with the mood of Slack. Slack has a sort of a playfulness to it that matches my personality. But when I think about our Striver software, the sort of colorfulness and the playfulness of Slack would be out of place in a training software. So I've been exploring what is the mood that we are trying to convey. These are sort of some of the characteristics that I think that we're trying to convey. One thing that's always very important is that our software is professional. However, I think that this can go too far. One of the touchstones I've come to is I want Striver Player to feel like Brian Meek is giving you one-on-one mentorship. Now, the reason I've come to this is no one would ever interact with Brian and say that he was unprofessional. Brian is a very professional person. But when you interact with him, when he mentors you, you still have a feeling of his personality and his empathy for you. Brian is professional, but he does have a character. And along with all of these professional characteristics, he has an emotional connection to each and every one of us when we interact with him. This is something that's very difficult for corporate software to convey, but this is something I've thought about a lot. I'm still working on it, but I want our software to have something of that character in it, something of like Brian's character, where it's interacting with you, it's guiding you, and sometimes it's even critical of you, but it's doing it from a place of empathy, and it does have its own personality. It's not a machine. So talking about making our software look better, why is it so important for our software to look good and to feel good? We just had one of our biggest high points, I think, that we've had as our company, which is that we made that huge deal with Walmart. We were 10% of all Oculus Go sales. If we want to continue this trend, it's no longer enough for Striver software to be functional and for it to be good. It has to be great. And for our software to be great, we have to go to the next level. I've thought a lot about enterprise software. I used to work in the Louisiana state government maintaining healthcare databases. And we had a tool like this built in WPF that I maintained. And our users had to use this tool, and I had to use this tool, unfortunately. And when I look back at this interface and I think about this interface, my primary emotion is fear, because this was not a forgiving interface. If a user chose the wrong drop-downs and made the wrong selection, they would make an error in the database I was maintaining that I would then have to go in and clean up manually and fix. This software was very unforgiving, and this sort of was conveyed by the appearance of the software. When you see an interface like this, you think Ted in the basement made this software. And if I want to use this software, I have to make sure that I'm on good terms with Ted. Because if I fuck up, I got to ask Ted, how do I fix it? If he doesn't like me, he's not going to tell me, right? When I look at something like Netflix, I have a feeling of trust. I know that Netflix is probably going to do what I expect it to do. If I click on Cargo, I'm probably going to watch a scary-looking show called Cargo. I'm not going to make like a null-pointer reference exception to the database. So it's sort of subtle, but I think it just comes down to when we see good design, we trust it. And when we see bad design, we're afraid of it. We don't trust it. It's how we recognize scams, right? If you see a website that's a scam website, it just sort of, something's not quite right about it. We want our software to feel trustworthy. This is why these details I'm talking about are so important to me right now, because every little detail we add to the design is going to create trust in our users. I think sometimes we think of design as an adornment, like we're building the house and then we're like putting frilly pink curtains on it. But good design is not just adornment. Good design is built into the underlying structure of the product. This is why I've been working on these details. Like this detail where the beam is pushing the cart around, this seems kind of just like something that is inconsequential. But if we create the concept of a selection metaphor, that every time you see an object and you hover over it, it has all of these characters. It pulls forward, it tilts, it has a white border. You're going to have this feeling of trust that if I see these qualities, then I know this is a selectable object. I can click on this. So it's not just an adornment. This is a functional benefit to our software to create these designs and create these new metaphors. And that's why it's so critical that we change our process and emphasize design and get to this sort of new world where Striver Player has a holistic feel to it. This is sort of my goal for the next year, is to redo everything in Striver Player so that it feels cohesive. One of the things that we've had to do is do a lot of user testing, because I have a lot of assumptions about how computers work and how interfaces work that not everybody may share. And from doing these user tests, I found out a lot of things I thought I would take for granted, I can't take for granted. This white line was intended to show that this is sort of the edge of this folder, and our users thought it was a scroll bar. I never would have imagined that, because I've been staring at this white line for a month. But we had to get rid of that white line because people thought it was a scroll bar. One of the things I think we often forget is that we are not our own target audience. All of us are computer geeks, every single one of us. I don't care what your role is. You're all computer geeks compared to the average person. And our users don't necessarily fit that profile. You guys are all Sonic the motherfucking Hedgehog, okay? You're gotta go fast, you know what a keyboard is, you know what VR is. Whereas our users, they're more like Big the Cat here. They don't necessarily know all of these things. One of the stark things I've seen from working with people is, you can ask Shani about this, if you talk to someone who is in our actual demographic, right? They could be a teenager getting their first job at Walmart. They could be an elderly person who's been sort of out of the workplace for a few years, and they pick up something like the Oculus Go controller. When I pick up the Oculus Go controller, I'm like, pow, 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 pow. When these people pick up the Oculus Go controller, this is what they do, right? They have no awareness that there's this trigger button on the back of the controller, because this is a metaphor that's come out of like gaming. I think this is PlayStation 1 or 2 introduced this concept. And if you're not part of that generation, you don't know about this. So we had to add this to the acclamation screens to really point out, hey, behind the controller, there's a button. You got to pay attention to that button. That button is important. You're going to need it. This has been a bit of a challenge because it's difficult to find these users. Out of our company, there are very few of us who are naive enough to fit this profile. I still don't know exactly how we're going to source, but we really need to source users who are like our actual users. So these are some of the learnings I feel like I've got in general from my experiences, and I'm open to any questions. I got all kinds of cool stuff you can ask me about. Let me know.
Yeah, one thing you didn't mention that I think is important in achieving what you're talking about is a style guide.
Yeah.
So you're not inventing new styles every day. So the color gradient, you know what the color stops are, all that hoo-ha, and both sides of the fence work to that style guide.
So I talked briefly about like the character of Striver products, and I think Yazan is going to give a really excellent presentation on that in the future, and he can talk more to that point.
Hey, Rostin?
Yeah.
Hi, Olivia on the screen. Hi. Forgive me if I should know this, but going back to the users that we have, like, have we considered focus group testing, or have we ever done, anything like that prior?
We've been talking about it. I think that's a process that we need to develop more. Again, I think, Shani's on vacation, but she knows probably the most about this, and I'm very interested in getting more involved in this so that I can actually meet with people who do use our software day to day. But it's definitely been, I think, a challenge that we need to overcome.
Okay, thank you. And you need a TED Talks, by the way, so thanks.
Not sure I understood that.
This is a little bit of a joke, but basically,
Oh, can you repeat the question?
sorry, yeah. Tyrone asked me about encapsulation. I mentioned encapsulation, hiding things versus showing things. So one of the things I've seen in the past, if I'm working with Paul on like a flat screen, Paul will say, oh, the color is 02FGA6, like a hex code, right? And then as the engineer, I'll make like a private constant variable in a script that's hidden from everybody that has that color in it. If Paul then wanted to go in and change that color, it's not possible for him to do unless he goes into the script and goes into the code. One of the things I think we need to think about and we need to break a little bit is, as engineers, at least during a prototyping phase, like I'm doing, we need to have some kind of way to enable that and expose those things that we might normally hide. I'm not saying show everything, but I'm saying if it's relevant to design, you should show it until it's finalized. This is something that I want us to work on. Yeah.
You've talked about how you've had to change your mindset, but what are the advantages that you're bringing having that engineering background design now?
I think I talked a little about blue sky, and one of the differences between the design department and the engineering department is the design department wants to be as blue sky as possible, and the engineering department wants to get it done. And I'm hoping what I can bring to the table is help us find the right balance between those things. Because if we go too deep out into blue sky, we won't be able to make those changes.
The tree line.
Yeah, we need to find sort of this boundary between the blue sky and being down to earth. So, for example, I made these prototype branches to demonstrate my changes, and then I wrote a document that explained to an engineer how you would take this black box I made and what considerations you would give to implement that into master. And I don't think a designer without that background couldn't necessarily do that. Might not be able to make, like all these prototypes I'm showing you, these are all real, right? They really work. They're not just designs on paper. They're really implemented in a real product as a prototype. But so that's what I hope to bring to the table.
What I understand for the first one is that the building tools is the building tools around for that. So tools for us that allow engineers and designers to work, move forward, and really best product.
So
showing parameters or exposing.
yeah. So Tyrone's asking me about tooling, and I think tooling is very important. The key thing for me is I want to make sure that if we build a tool, we're building it for someone. So I agree with you, but I want to make sure that when we build tools, we're like, I'm building this tool for Tony or Tony's role. And then that way I can validate the tool. I think if I just build a tool from scratch and I don't have a specific person who's going to use that tool, I don't think I'll be able to build it the right way, if that makes sense. So that's why I haven't necessarily taken the step of actually building tools yet until I have someone who's going to use those tools specifically. I did do a couple things, like for Tony, I built a script that lets him switch between scenes easily, and I have a PR out for that now. So I am starting to build tools, but I want to build them slowly, and I want to make sure that they're tools that we're actually going to use, because if we build tools without maintaining them, they'll become rusty.
I agree with you. Java Plataka is more consumers than Plataka. But I think in your classification, you compare interplace software, consumer software. I think this is two different things. One is Apple, one is Orange.
That's fair. So the question is, how can you compare enterprise software to consumer software? Definitely very fair. However, this is what I think about, okay? There are pieces of software that can be considered enterprise software, which have the feeling of consumer software. Netflix is an extreme example because that's literally consumer software. It's not enterprise. However, consider Adobe products. Consider Photoshop. Photoshop is in sort of a middle ground where you could say it's a piece of consumer software, but it's used by enterprises. That's where we want to be. If we were to sell Striver Creator, as an example, we would want Striver Creator to feel like iMovie, to feel like Adobe Photoshop. We wouldn't want it to feel like that government tool I used.
Again, I agree that our creator or more like Adobe, because this is the nature of the product. But the interplay software, they dealing with data and the workflow process. And think about a car on the dashboard, consumer usage. But you cannot design the front engine or something like a consumer product. They need to interact together. So different.
So the question is about how do we create things like databases? How do we approach those as a consumer product? I think one of the key things about design is that design exposes what's relevant to the user. So this is why our personas are so critical. Creator is a good example because we've been struggling with creator. And I think there's two different mindsets at our company. One mindset is that creator is for our IDs, and it's for people who are comfortable using a difficult interface where they can actually see the underlying data. Now, there's another persona and another perspective that we've been struggling with, which is that creator as a piece of software that we give to people who haven't necessarily done a tutorial on it, right? And for creator to be like that, it has to be more like an Adobe product. So I think that there is a world where we have a product that has all of these things. It has a database, it has all these complicated things, but the user doesn't worry about that, right? So of course, your car has an engine, but you as the user of the car, you don't worry about your engine unless your car breaks down, right? You're worried about the finish, the paint job, the style, the acceleration. So for that metaphor, creator would not make you think about the database. You wouldn't even, as a user, you wouldn't even imagine, oh, creator has a database, the database is not responding. It would just work, right? It would do what you wanted it to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, certainly. We all the little bit.
I mean, getting there, of course, is very difficult. I'm not saying like I know the path to get there. Like this is something that we've struggled with for 2 years. We're going to continue to struggle with. But this is the kind of process we have to follow to improve. And I don't have all the answers. I'm like learning this stuff myself. I'm being broken and remade every day. Oh no, yeah. This is something I learned, by the way. I took a design course, and one of the principles was, if someone asks you why, like why is it purple, you always have to have an answer. It always has to be a very specific answer. You have to know why. It has to have a function. So it's purple because it's a nice neutral color, and it matches with the gray.
Why the gray?
It's gray because we're not committing to a specific hue, and it's Tony's fault. Tony.
So speaking of colors and the encapsulation of data,
Yes.
does this framework not provide CSS or the equivalent thereof to not have hard code visual renders?
Absolutely not. VR does not have Unity does not have CSS.
Or nothing even equivalent. You gotta hard code your RGB into the code.
Unity does have things that you can use, but they're not CSS. We've tried to kind of bring HTML or CSS into Unity, and we've just looked at it and we're like, don't do it. It's a trap. It's not a good plan.
Thanks, Rawson.
Yeah.
Let's,
Okay.
Good volume, very good.
Okay.